So Connected, a home but not alone workshop taught and designed by Colleen Brady, regional trainer for the Vermont Child Welfare Training Partnership. Why sewing? Today we're going to be talking about using sewing to encourage connection and healing with kids who have a trauma history. Sewing encourages connection. This is such an important foundation block for encouraging healing. Also, when hands are busy, minds can relax. A relaxed mind is a challenge for these children. Because of their history, they can tend to be anxious and distracted. Worries about their parents, siblings, safety, or food can keep their minds working in overdrive. Learning a new skill builds creative competence and grows self-esteem. More important foundation blocks in promoting resiliency. And finally, sewing builds patience and focus. Here are some tips for successful sewing sessions. Be prepared. Have needles threaded and materials organized and close by. If there are materials that should be used by an adult only, have those closer to you and explain safety to the child. What's important here is process over product. Making a connection, building relationships, letting them make decisions are all much more important than what they're making. Read their cues for stamina. Learning a new skill could be exciting for some children and overwhelming for others. This is a project that you can stop at any time and pick up later. Also use a my turn, your turn strategy. My turn is a way to show them what to do and how to do it. You model and they learn. This also encourages attunement. Attunement is the way we tune in to a child's needs, and we work to understand their thoughts and we respond to how they're feeling and behaving. Now let's tune in to Colleen, who will walk us through this project.
Today is about sewing a pillow, and you can use any kind of fabric. Use felt squares because it doesn't fray on the edges and it's really easy to push a needle through. So I prefer to use felt squares, but you can use absolutely anything you have available. You can use an old tablecloth, you can use a pillowcase, you can use an old shirt. Absolutely anything works for fabric. Today I'm going to be showing you on a piece of felt. So the first thing you need to do is you have two pieces of fabric, what you're going to put on the front, and you need to make that decision before you actually stitch it. And there's lots of possibilities. I like to have animal stencils that kids use. I sometimes make paper patterns for kids, and then they can put that right on the fabric and trace around it and cut it out. But it is also perfectly okay to just freeform it, to just start cutting in some scrap fabric and make either an animal or even just shapes. One thing I like to do with kids is kind of ask them if they have a clear idea in their mind about what they want to make or whether they'd like a suggestion. And if they'd like a suggestion, then I might just offer some ideas by age. So if you have some younger sewers, you might just want to have a pile of scraps in the middle of the table that they can literally pick up and glue onto the front. If it's a slightly older child, then you can offer them full pieces of still scraps or full pieces of felt or fabric and have them just start cutting things out. Another very popular thing to do on the front is to use buttons. Buttons are super fun for kids to learn how to sew. So just sewing a bunch of buttons on the front can be really fun, but also can be parts of animals. And so an old jar of buttons is a handy thing to have available for this project. Whatever is decided to put on the front, there are all sorts of glues you can use. I happen to have a couple. It's called tacky glue. Both of those work really well, but really white Elmer's glue works perfectly fine as well. Sometimes, depending on how quickly a certain child might move in these kinds of projects, I will be in charge of the glue and just say, you tell me where you want it and I'll go ahead and glue it for you. Because the glue is often a part that goes awry, as in too much. You need to decide. So I'm just going to show you the one that I created just to give you an idea. It's an animal. I cut some fabric pieces for some polka dots on the cow. I sewed a button for the eye, and I used some yarn I had to just cut in a bunch of pieces to put on for a tail. But honestly, it doesn't have to be this fancy at all. And I usually don't even have an example when I do projects with kids like this, because once they see the way the adult's version looks, then they're trying to emulate it being just like that or just as sophisticated as that. And so sometimes it takes away their impulse for creativity. So often I don't really have an example. I just have a bunch of materials and let kids choose what makes sense for them. After the front has been finished, then becomes the stitching time. And that's where having already threaded needles comes in handy. I use embroidery floss because it becomes part of the decoration of the pillow. It's kind of fun. It comes in lots of colors. And I use needles that have quite large eyes at the top. You can also buy needles that look like this, that are plastic and have a very large eye at the top. I don't favor those as much because they're really hard to push through the fabric. And I'm thinking all the time about what can I do to eliminate frustration in this, and trying to push this needle through fabric is actually quite frustrating. So even though it looks safer to use something like this, I would recommend using actual needles instead. Another strategy that I use to help kids with the sewing, you can see that I put little dots all along the edge of the pillow. So that's just a little bit of I did that with a permanent marker. And that's just a little bit of a guide for where your needle could continue to come up as kind of just a strategy for helping kids understand how many stitches they need to take and where they need to take their stitches. I like to think when I'm sewing with kids that you can expect it to be a little bit like fishing with kids. There are going to be tangles. There are going to be oopses, lots of them. You're going to have kids hand you things that say there's things that look tangled. My usual response is to say, that looks like something we can fix. But then I usually put it back on the child and say, do you have an idea for how to fix it? But I'm also really ready to jump in if I feel like they're getting discouraged or frustrated and say, let's take a look at that and go ahead and fix it for them and get them back on track. That's an example of a my turn, your turn too, where it's just kind of like, why don't you give me my turn for a second and then it will be your turn. And you can kind of either just cut the thread, tie it off and start again, or if it's possible, you can kind of untangle it and keep going. The stitch that's used for this is really just a stitch that is a repeated stitch of coming from the bottom and pulling through the top. So from the bottom, and oftentimes I'll repeat that with kids a lot as we're sewing. From the bottom to the top, from the bottom to the top, bottom to the top. All the way, you can see how the stitch becomes a part of the design of the pillow. When you are finished with this length of thread, just cut it off, tie a knot, thread another one, and keep on going until you get all the way to the end. I recommend not having very, very long pieces of embroidery floss to be dealing with. Long piece of thread is too long, even though it may seem like let's keep this going without needing to stop for a while. If it's too long, it gets really difficult to control. So you would continue all the way, sewing all the way around, having to stop, tie knots, put new thread on, keep sewing all the way around, and leaving about this much room to put in the stuffing. And you can just stop and have your needle just dangle like that at this place right here where you would stop, and then fill stuffing. This is also something you can get at a craft store, but it's also not necessary. You can also take apart an old pillow and just use the stuffing from an old pillow. I've even had kids use Kleenexes because we didn't have any stuffing and they just really wanted to do it right then and there, or paper towels. So really, this is something that you would get at a craft store, and a bag of this goes a long way. After you have stuffed it, then you just go ahead and take your thread and you finish off the edge, tie a knot there, and the pillow is finished. One of the things that I've found over time with sewing pillows is that once a child has done one, they seem to want to make a lot of them. It's that whole idea of building competence and feeling pride at what you're doing. And so what happens a lot is that pillows become a thing for a while, and it can become a repeated activity to kind of pull out from time to time. It's great for rainy days, and it's great for presents for families and friends. So it can be something that a child would eventually perhaps become independent with and be able to just accomplish by themselves. Does anybody have any questions at this point?
Colleen, I don't do a lot of crafty things with the kids, and they like crafty things because they do it at school. I would have no idea where to even get supplies like this, or embroidery floss. I don't know what that is. So where would I go?
Okay, well, I think that that a one-stop shop for all of what I just talked about, the felt, the glue, the embroidery floss, and the filling, could all be purchased at a craft store like Michael's or Joann's Fabric. Those are available at all of those stores.
Oh,
and
okay.
Honestly, these pieces of felt are 39 cents a piece. It's not terrifically expensive. Once you have a bunch of it, you can just keep it in a box somewhere and it just can all live there. But I have also found a lot of different things like this at garage sales and lawn sales. You know, containers of buttons, embroidery floss. So sometimes that can be purchased that way.
Floss?
What is it?
Yeah, what does it look like?
Okay, so here's a spool of embroidery floss. I mean, there is a whole craft skill that's called embroidery that has certain kinds of stitches, but this is also the kind of line that gets used for friendship bracelets, or it's that silky thread. So let's finish up. So what comes next? Organize the materials to have at the ready. It's great to just buy things and with no expectation about when it's going to be done, but just have them ready for when you might want to use them. I would recommend waiting for a calm time to introduce this activity, even though it might seem like a good idea to pull it out when things are, the kids are jumping up and down. I definitely think it's best to look for that opening of a time when it might be a little more calm. Try to have reasonable expectations. I've had kids do all kinds of levels of finish on these kinds of projects. I had one child even get frustrated with the sewing and run up and get the stapler and staple it because it took too long to sew. So having reasonable expectations about what the finished product is going to look like is key to it all. And it's all about connection. If it's not fun, try abandoning the ship and just return to it at another time.